Alrighty, everyone, so I got a pretty interesting question here from Dutchy Rich. Hope I pronounced that right. He says, I recently suffered a herniated disc in my neck and I haven't been able to lift or really do much of anything for like 5 months. My strength has certainly deteriorated and my muscles feel like they've shriveled up. I'm 40 years old. My question is, do you think I'll ever be able to handle heavy weight again, or should I just accept that those days have passed and take up crocheting? Well, this is a fun question for me because this is essentially what I do for my job. So, the director of sports medicine, at a school, my master's degree is actually in sports medicine and athletic rehab. So we're going to pan this out a little bit and not just talk about herniated discs in the neck. We're going to talk discs in general along the entire spine, and kind of like what healing processes are, and kind of go into a little bit of stuff. So first things first, to answer your question, Mr. Dutchy Rich, no, you shouldn't give up on training fully and take up crocheting. Unless you want to, absolutely feel free, but lifting is not out of the question for you. So here's the thing, and a huge common misconception with herniated discs that people think. They think once their disc is herniated, their life is over, and they can't do anything functional anymore, and that's completely not true. So, fun fact, around 80% of people in the world are walking around today with a disc herniation in their back. It's just asymptomatic and they don't know they have it. So chances are, I've been doing Strongman for 9 years. The chances I actually have a disc herniation are pretty fucking high. I just don't know it. It doesn't bother me and I don't think about it, so I don't get any pain. So here's the thing. If you're having symptoms with a disc herniation, absolutely go get it checked out. Because what that can be doing, it could be pressing on your spinal cord, which can be then causing radicular symptoms, which is, radiating symptoms to the lower extremities. If it is in your neck, then you'd be getting issues out to your upper extremities. And obviously you want to get that taken care of. The biggest thing for you is to find a really good physical therapist or a physiotherapist, and make sure they understand what your goals are. The nice thing as a patient is you usually have the choice of who treats you. And if you go to somebody and they say, oh, this is gonna take 4 years, you're never gonna be able to lift again, that's not the right fucking person you should be going to see. You need to see somebody that understands you as a patient and wants to see you succeed and reach your goals with you, and not pretty much just talk against you and say, this is the textbook answer of what you're gonna see. We'll lay you on a table, give you some massage, and that's gonna be all you're gonna do because this is just gonna be part of your life for the rest of your life. I mean, granted, herniations can, not always, but they can reduce and actually suck themselves back into the disc. And it might not be all the way, it could be partially, but it would help reduce some of that pain. However, even if the herniation doesn't recede back into the disc, you can still become asymptomatic by strengthening the muscles around where the herniation is, increasing range of motion, and just doing a lot of stuff to help decrease pain in general. So the tricky thing is that with disc herniations is they do press on the nerves in the spine, and that can cause pain and discomfort and dysfunction in all different parts of the body. Story time, I once worked with an athlete who had a lumbar disc herniation in his low back, and it was pressing on his spinal cord, but he actually didn't present with any low back pain. He presented with pain in his ankle and his foot. And then so initially I started treating ankle and foot pain, and then all of a sudden there was one day where he couldn't lift his foot up and his toe was dragging when he would walk. And then we kind of had to work backwards, and then we worked up the kinetic chain, found out he actually had a disc herniation, then we had to treat the herniation, which then reversed everything down low. So the problem with herniations is they're hard. It's difficult to find a therapist that's willing to put in the work with you. But as I mentioned before, finding somebody that is as invested as you are in the rehab is absolutely essential to you getting better and getting back to what you want to do. So talking a little bit more about injuries, we talk about disc herniations and stuff like that. Since we're on this topic, we'll just talk about common strongman injuries in general. And, a big thing that we see is tendon ruptures, we see tendonitis, we see bone fractures, happened to me a few weeks ago. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in strongman because we put ourselves at such a high risk of injury every single day with the events that we do. So when we're looking at fractures, those are going to be the easiest ones for us to talk about. You always hear the myth that, a fractured bone is stronger than your original bone. And Yes and no. So where the fracture happens, the bone does calcify a little bit stronger in that spot where the fracture was. So that is true. However, now that you have a strong part of the bone in the middle of it, you essentially have two weaker spots on either end of where the fracture originally was. So it's not to say that you're going to break your bone again. It's just saying that, you know, you're potentially at a higher risk for another fracture, not in the same spot. You won't break the bone in the same spot, most likely. However, on either side of where the fracture site was, those are now a little bit weaker compared to where the fracture site was in the first place. When we're jumping around to like tendons and ligaments, that's where things can get a little bit iffy. So when we look at like a joint sprain, that's a common misconception. People say sprain and strain, think they're interchangeable. They're not. A sprain is a ligamentous injury. A strain is a muscular or a tendinous injury. Ligaments, again, are things that connect bone to bone. So when we look at like the ankle joint, there are a bunch of ligaments, and you hear like ankle sprains all the time. Those usually happen on the outside of the ankle. Ligaments can take a decent amount of time to heal because they have fairly limited blood flow, and blood flow is quintessential to any injury healing that we have. So the biggest thing when treating like a joint sprain, unfortunately, a strongman's worst fear is hearing rest, because that's essentially the only thing that we can do in the first few days after a joint sprain is kind of rest. The second thing is going to be range of motion and making sure we're getting back the range of motion that we lost from the injury itself. And then the other thing we have to look at is tissue quality. So when we get a joint sprain, the ligaments, the fibers should align kind of like this. And this is going to be the same thing I say with tendons and muscles. The fibers should align nice and smooth. But when we get a sprain, essentially what that happens is we get micro tears and disruption of the fibers themselves. So the fibers go from here and then they get all fucked up and now they're like this. So when I say tissue quality, what we have to do is essentially some manual therapy and some massage to essentially break up those adhesions and realign muscle fibers. And that's what's going to get the ligaments to heal a little bit quicker. Looking at tendons and muscles, again, you know, a common thing we see in strongman is tendon ruptures. If that's the case, tough luck. You're probably going to have to get surgery. That's the only thing that's going to help you. When we're looking at muscle tears, depending on where the tear is, if it's a muscle belly, can usually rehab that with some rest and some, again, looking at tissue quality, range of motion, getting everything back into the right order, and the muscles will usually repair themselves pretty easily. A really common thing that we see in strongman is tendonitis or tendinosis. They're kind of the same thing. And that is from an overuse of a certain body part, working within a certain range of motion way too often. And then also what causes it is your muscles are getting stronger at a faster rate than your tendons are, which is pulling strain on the tendon and causing them to get inflamed and cause that injury. So the biggest thing with tendonitis, again, is what I said with the joint sprain, is resting for a little while and not working in the range of motion that's causing pain. So that means, you know, for me, previously when I was training for the Log Lift World Challenge this year in 2018, my right arm was completely fucked up because I was training heavy log, heavy dumbbell, and heavy back squats because World's Strongest Man was only a few weeks after. So I was trying to cram all this heavy training into, you know, to these short sessions in a short amount of time. So constantly being like torqued down and in these weird positions caused a lot of stuff to go wrong in my right arm, where I had tendonitis in 3 different spots. So the biggest thing for tendonitis is you can still train, but don't train in ranges of motion that cause pain. So obviously I had to stop doing log press, dumbbell, and back squats, but I could still deadlift, I could still bench press, and I could still do some upper body movements that didn't make the symptoms increase. Treating the inflammation if there is any, so making sure, again, we're doing that massage that I talked about, trying to realign the fibers, making sure the tissue quality is there. And then the biggest thing that's gonna help a tendonitis is doing what we call eccentric exercises. So an eccentric contraction, so a muscle fiber has 2 types of contractions, well 3, but we're gonna talk about 2. It has a concentric and an eccentric. So a concentric is like a regular bicep curl, so the muscle shortens as it's contracting, all right? An eccentric muscle contraction essentially is when the muscle is contracted, but the muscle is elongating. So if I was holding my bicep here, have a full contraction, and then had another force pushing me out, but I was resisting that force, but it was stronger than me, so my bicep's still contracting, but I'm lengthening, that's what we call an eccentric contraction. What we found in research is that eccentric movements really help treating tendonitis, because it focuses on the tendon and not so much the muscle. So we're actually focusing on that tendon strength instead of the muscle belly strength. And those eccentric exercises are what's gonna help kind of reduce that inflammation and strengthen the tendon and get rid of your tendonitis a little bit quicker. A lot of information I just threw at you about injuries within the entire body. You know, if you have any other questions related to your injury specifically, or I mean, just something that's been nagging you for a long time or something that you see that's super common in Strongman, hit us up on the website. You know, ask any questions you have. Find me on Instagram, shoot me a message, write me a comment. Would be happy to help you out and hopefully make sure you're not getting hurt.